They buried my drain under a mountain of snow, and when I locked it up, 85 homes up the hill started to panic. That is not an exaggeration. That is exactly how it happened. My name is Daniel Harper. I am 58 years old, and I live at the very bottom of a place called Ridgecrest Hollow, a tidy little HOA development tucked into the hills of western Massachusetts. If you stand on my back deck and look up, you see rows of big houses climbing the slope like steps, all vinyl siding and wide windows and decks with stainless steel grills. If you stand up there and look down, you see my place, older, wood-sided, oak trees leaning over the roof, gravel driveway, the kind of house that was here before the word development ever showed up on a brochure. What most people do not see, what you would not notice unless you knew where to look, is the 24-inch storm drain that cuts across the edge of my lower yard. It is not pretty. It is a concrete culvert with a steel grate, half hidden by brush in the summer. But that pipe is the reason those 85 homes can sit comfortably on that hill every spring when the snow melts. All of their runoff funnels down toward me. Every driveway, every street, every tidy little patch of lawn slopes in my direction. Decades ago, when the original farmer sold the upper acreage to a developer, the town required a drainage easement across what is now my property. The agreement was recorded in 1981. It says they can route stormwater through that culvert as long as they maintain clear access and keep it unobstructed. As long as they maintain clear access. That sentence is going to matter later. I bought this house 12 years ago, after my wife passed. It was quiet down here. The oaks were older than any of us. In the fall, the leaves would stack up along the fence, and I would rake them into slow, smoky piles like my dad used to. I did not mind living below the fancy houses. In fact, I liked it. Their streetlights did not reach me. Their HOA meetings were none of my business. I kept to myself, fixed up the porch, planted tomatoes, learned the rhythm of the place. The first few winters were fine. Snow would fall, the plows would come through up top, and I would see neat white ridges lining their roads. Some of that snow would slide down the slope, sure, but nothing major. The drain stayed clear. Last winter was different. We had storm after storm, heavy wet snow that stuck to everything. And the HOA had hired a new contractor, a company out of Albany with shiny trucks and wide steel plows. They worked fast. Too fast. The first time I noticed something was off, I was out back splitting firewood. I heard the scrape of metal up the hill, then the rumble of a truck idling longer than usual. I looked up and saw a white wave cresting over the ridge, and then, like an avalanche in slow motion, a load of plowed snow came sliding down the embankment and spilled right into my yard. Not a little spill, a deliberate dump. I stood there with my gloves on, watching it settle over the grate. I remember thinking, well, that is new. I walked up the slope as far as I could without trespassing and caught one of the drivers before he pulled away. Hey, man, you cannot dump that down here, I called. He leaned out his window. We were told this is the designated runoff area. Designated by who? He shrugged. Talk to the HOA. That was my introduction to how this was going to go. Over the next few weeks, every time it snowed, they plowed the streets clean and pushed the excess straight toward the edge, where gravity did the rest. By mid-February, there was a 12-foot mound sitting right on top of my drain grate. It looked like a small glacier had decided to winter in my backyard. I took pictures, not because I was angry yet, but because something about it felt careless. Then the thaw started. In New England, thaw does not happen politely. It creeps in during the day, drips at night, freezes again, then comes back harder. The first warm spell turned that snow mountain into a slow leaking sponge. Water pooled around the grate, but it could not enter. The weight of compacted snow and ice had sealed it tight. The next morning I stepped into my basement and felt the cold squish under my boots. At first it was just a thin layer, barely covering the concrete. I told myself it was seepage. Old house, old foundation, it happens. By evening it was an inch deep. I shut off the furnace when I saw water licking at the base. That furnace was only 3 years old. I stood there in the dim basement light listening to the hum fade out, and for the first time I felt something more than annoyance. I felt exposed. I called the HOA president the next day. His name was Victor Langley, a retired marketing executive who moved up from Connecticut and treated Ridgecrest Hollow like a personal branding exercise. He answered on the third ring, voice smooth as polished granite. Daniel, what can I do for you? You can stop burying my drain, I said. My basement just flooded. There was a pause, the kind where someone is deciding whether your problem is worth their attention. Snow removal is handled by the contractor, he said finally. If there is an issue, you can submit it in writing. Victor, your contractor is dumping snow directly on top of the drainage easement. The agreement says you have to maintain access. We maintain the infrastructure, Daniel. The culvert is functional. It is not functional if it is under 12 feet of snow. He sighed, light, almost amused. I will have Public Works look into it. Public Works turned out to be a woman named Karen Doyle, younger than Victor, sharp, efficient, the kind of person who speaks in bullet points. She came by 2 days later, boots crunching over the ice in my yard. She looked at the mound, then at the grate barely visible beneath. This is the most efficient location for snow storage, she said. It is downhill. It is also the only exit point for 85 homes, I replied. She folded her arms. The drain itself is structurally sound. My furnace is not. That was flood number 1. By the time March rolled in, it had happened twice more. Each thaw cycle sent water backing up into my basement, soaking boxes I had not opened in years, including 2 full of old family photographs. My wife laughing at the beach. My parents in front of the first house they bought. Ink running, faces blurring. There is a particular smell when cardboard sits in cold water too long. It is sour and stale and final. That was when annoyance turned into something else. Not rage. Not yet. Resolve. By the 3rd flood, I stopped reacting and started thinking. There is a difference. The first time water crept across my basement floor, I felt blindsided. The second time, I felt dismissed. The third time, standing there with a shop vac humming and the air thick with that wet cardboard smell, I felt something settle in my chest like a weight finding its place. They were not going to fix this because it was easier not to. And as long as the consequences pooled in my basement instead of their living rooms, nothing would change. So I went upstairs, made coffee, and pulled out the file cabinet where I keep the boring stuff. Deeds, tax bills, old inspection reports. I found the easement agreement, yellowed at the edges, stamped and signed back in 1981. I sat at the kitchen table and read it line by line. The language was plain. The property owner, meaning me, grants a perpetual drainage easement to the Ridgecrest Hollow Association for the purpose of stormwater conveyance. In consideration, the association agrees to maintain unobstructed access to the culvert and to prevent blockage of the intake structure. Prevent blockage, not respond to blockage. Prevent it. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I started documenting everything. I took wide shots of the snow being pushed over the ridge. I recorded video during the thaw, water sloshing uselessly against the packed ice. I photographed the basement floor with a tape measure in the frame showing depth. I saved receipts for the furnace repair estimate, for the dehumidifiers I rented, for the ruined storage bins. I am not a litigious guy. I have never sued anyone. I do not enjoy conflict. But I also spent 25 years running a small construction business. I know what contracts mean. I know what it looks like when someone counts on you not reading the fine print. A week later, I requested a meeting with Victor and Karen at the HOA office up the hill. It is a small building near the clubhouse, all beige siding and motivational landscaping. I remember walking in with mud still on my boots, feeling slightly out of place among framed photos of community barbecues and holiday light contests. Victor gestured for me to sit. Karen had a folder open already, probably notes about me. Daniel, Victor began, we understand you have concerns about snow management. Concerns is one word for it, I said. Karen slid a printed map across the table. The topography makes downhill storage unavoidable. Alternative hauling would significantly increase association costs. So the cheaper option is to flood my house. That is not what I said, she replied evenly. It is what is happening. Victor leaned back in his chair. The culvert has functioned for decades. Not under 12 feet of compacted snow. He steepled his fingers. We are not responsible for acts of nature. I let that hang for a second. Snow is nature, I said. Dumping it directly onto a drainage easement is not. The room went quiet. I pulled out a copy of the easement and placed it on the table, open to the highlighted clause. You are required to maintain unobstructed access. 3 floods in 8 weeks says you are not doing that. Karen's jaw tightened. The drain itself is intact. The structure is not damaged. My furnace is. My property is. My photographs are. Victor's expression shifted slightly, impatience creeping in. Daniel, if you believe you have incurred damages, you are free to pursue them through appropriate channels. There it was. The polite version of "see you in court." I stood up, gathered my papers. "You have 6 weeks before full spring melt," I said. "After that, this becomes a much bigger problem than my basement." Victor gave me a thin smile. "We will take that under advisement." Walking back down the hill, I realized something important. They believed I was bluffing. Not maliciously, not dramatically. They just assumed I would grumble, maybe file a complaint, and eventually absorb the loss because that is what the downslope guy does. That night, I called an old friend, Marty Sullivan, who used to fabricate custom steel gates before he retired. I told him I needed something specific. A heavy-duty steel grate, reinforced, with hinge brackets and a lock plate. Something that could sit over an existing intake and be secured. He whistled low over the phone. "You planning on keeping people out or keeping water in?" "Maybe both," I said. We measured the culvert opening the next morning. Marty scratched his chin, ran numbers in his head, and quoted me $800 for materials and labor. It was not cheap, but neither was replacing a furnace. While he worked in his shop, welding sparks lighting up the dim space, I drafted a letter. Not angry, not dramatic, just precise. I itemized everything. $12,400 for remediation and repairs from 3 separate flood events, based on contractor estimates. $3,600 to excavate and clear the compacted snow and ice that had buried the drain, plus labor to restore proper grading. $1,850 for destroyed personal property, conservatively valued. $800 for the custom grate required to secure the intake due to repeated obstruction. Total, $18,650. Then I added terms. Beginning immediately, the Ridgecrest Hollow Association would pay an annual maintenance fee of $2,800 for ongoing access to the drainage easement. They would submit written snow disposal plans for my review each winter. I would conduct quarterly inspections. The agreement would run 15 years. Any future intentional dumping of snow onto my property would constitute breach, and the drain would be sealed until compliance was restored. I read it twice. It did not sound like extortion to me. It sounded like risk management. The grate was installed on a cold, gray Tuesday. Marty and I bolted it over the existing intake, drilled anchor points into the concrete, and fitted a thick weatherproof padlock through the plate. When it swung shut, it made a solid, satisfying clang. I posted a simple sign on a metal stake beside it. "Drain closed due to HOA easement violation." Then I sent the letter certified mail to Victor and Karen. The response was faster this time. Victor called that evening. "Daniel, what exactly do you think you are doing?" "Enforcing the contract. You cannot unilaterally block critical infrastructure." "I did not. You did when you buried it." His tone sharpened. "This is extortion." "No, Victor. Extortion would be demanding money to solve a problem I created. I am billing you for one you ignored." There was heavy breathing on the other end, the sound of someone used to being cornered. "Spring melt begins in 6 weeks," I continued. "Without that culvert, every street up there becomes a shallow river. Your insurance policy excludes flood damage from obstructed infrastructure. You might want to read that clause." Silence. Karen called the next day, less heated but more strategic. "Daniel, we are exploring legal remedies," she said. "The association may pursue eminent domain if necessary." I actually laughed. Not cruelly, just honestly. "Karen, HOA boards are not government entities. You cannot condemn my property. We will consult counsel." "Please do." Meanwhile, the grate stayed locked. And for the first time since winter began, I slept through the night without checking the basement at 2 a.m. Up the hill, though, something shifted. Word travels fast in communities like that. I started noticing neighbors lingering at the edge of the slope, looking down at the locked grate. A few of them came to talk to me, cautious, curious. One couple, the Ramirez family from 2 houses up, brought coffee. "We had no idea they were dumping it all down here," Mrs. Ramirez said. "We thought it was just melting naturally." "It is not natural when a plow blade pushes it," I replied. She shook her head. "If that drain stays closed, are we really at risk?" "Yes," I said simply. I did not enjoy that answer, but it was true. Within a week, the HOA called for an emergency meeting. I was not a member, technically, but they invited me anyway. I walked into the clubhouse that evening to find folding chairs filled, tension humming louder than the soda machine in the corner. Victor stood at the front, no longer polished granite. He looked tired. "We are in discussions to resolve a drainage access dispute," he announced. Dispute is a funny word for 3 flooded basements, I muttered under my breath. Karen presented cost projections for alternative snow hauling. The numbers were ugly. So were potential flood damages if spring melt overwhelmed the streets. Then someone in the back raised a hand. Why are we just hearing about this now? The room turned restless. Victor glanced at me. Daniel has taken unilateral action. I stood up. I took action after 3 floods and months of being ignored. The easement requires unobstructed access. It was obstructed. Repeatedly. A murmur spread through the chairs. I am not trying to hurt anyone, I continued. I am trying to make sure my house does not pay the price for everyone else's convenience. That was the first time I saw doubt flicker across Victor's face. The melt was coming. The forecast showed a warm front rolling in from the south. Daytime highs in the 40s, then 50s. Time was no longer theoretical. It was ticking. The warm front rolled in on a Sunday afternoon. You could feel it before you saw it, that soft southern air pushing out the brittle cold, loosening everything it touched. Icicles began to drip. The snowpack on the hill darkened, sagging under its own weight. By evening, water was running in thin silver lines along the gutters up top, converging toward the slope that led, inevitably, to me. Only this time, the grate was locked. I stood at the edge of my yard with my hands in my jacket pockets and watched it happen. Not with satisfaction. Not exactly. More like a man watching a test he warned everyone about finally begin. The first rush hit around dusk. Meltwater streamed down the embankment, reached the culvert, and spread sideways when it found steel instead of open bars. It pooled, shallow at first, then deeper, searching for another path. Up the hill, I could hear it, a new sound under the usual suburban quiet. Not traffic, not wind. Water moving where it was not supposed to move. My phone buzzed before dark. It was Victor. Daniel, we need to talk. I let it ring once more before answering. I am listening. Water is accumulating on Crestline Drive. Residents are concerned. I bet they are. This is becoming a safety issue. It has been a safety issue since January. A long exhale on his end. What will it take to resolve this tonight? Not tonight, I said. This was never about tonight. It is about the agreement you signed last week. Because yes, they had signed. 2 days before the warm front, after a flurry of attorney emails and what I imagine were some very uncomfortable board discussions, the HOA agreed to settle. They wired the full $18,650 to my account and signed the 15-year maintenance contract. The first annual payment of $2,800 cleared the next morning. It was not dramatic when it happened. No handshake photo. No apology. Just signatures and numbers. But the grate stayed locked. Not out of spite. Out of caution. The contract included a clause requiring written confirmation of new snow management procedures and immediate removal of the existing snow mound. As of Sunday morning, that mound still sat like a stubborn monument to their earlier choices. Victor knew this. The excavation crew is scheduled for tomorrow, he said carefully. We need temporary access until then. I looked at the slope, at the water spreading wider now. Temporary access is what created this problem. Daniel. I heard something new in his voice. Not authority. Not impatience. Pressure. Behind him, I could faintly make out other voices, overlapping, anxious. You have 85 homeowners asking why their streets are turning into ponds, he said. They are not interested in contract language right now. I understand that, I replied. But contract language is the only reason we are not doing this again next winter. Silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of running water. Finally, he said, what do you want? I want the snow mound removed tonight, not tomorrow. I want written confirmation of the new disposal plan emailed before midnight. And I want Karen here, in person, to inspect the cleared intake with me before I unlock it. You are asking a lot on short notice. So was I when my basement flooded. There was a pause, shorter this time. Give us an hour. They managed it in 40 minutes. I will give them that. Floodlights appeared at the top of the hill, then the rumble of machinery. The same plow company that had been so efficient all winter returned. Only now they were not pushing snow toward my yard. They were loading it into trucks. Karen arrived just after 9, boots splashing through the shallow water that had crept halfway down the slope. She looked less bullet-point efficient and more human than I had seen her before. The crew carved into the mound with an excavator, breaking apart months of compacted layers. Chunks of ice thudded into truck beds. The grate slowly reemerged, steel cold and unyielding under the lights. Karen stood beside me, watching. This escalated quickly, she said quietly. It did not have to. She nodded once. No defensiveness, just acknowledgement. By 10:30, the intake was fully exposed. Water rushed toward it again, hit the locked grate, and this time had a clear path once opened. Karen crouched, ran a gloved hand along the concrete edge, checking for cracks. It is clear, she said. We will document this. I waited until I received the email on my phone. Subject line, Revised Snow Management Protocol. It outlined new hauling procedures, designated off-site storage, and a prohibition on dumping within 50 feet of my property line. It was detailed, specific. I looked at Karen. This needs to stick, I said. It will, she replied. I bent down, slid the key into the padlock, and for a second I just held it there. That small piece of brass carried a strange amount of weight, not just for the water backed up on Crestline Drive, but for the principle underneath it. Then I turned it. The lock clicked open. The grate swung outward with that same solid clang Marty and I had heard days earlier. The effect was immediate. Water that had been pooling hesitantly surged forward, disappearing into the dark mouth of the culvert. The shallow ponds up the slope began to thin, ripples smoothing out under the streetlights. You could almost hear the collective exhale traveling downhill. Victor called again 15 minutes later. The streets are clearing, he said. Good. There was another pause, but this one felt different. For what it is worth, he added, we should have handled this differently. Yes, you should have. It was not triumph I felt in that moment. Not exactly. It was something steadier. Balance. Over the next week, the melt continued, but the system held. Trucks hauled away remaining snow. Crews checked the intake twice. I conducted my first quarterly inspection with Karen beside me, both of us scribbling notes like reluctant partners in a project neither of us wanted, but both now understood. The basement stayed dry. The new furnace hummed without interruption. One evening, as the last patches of snow receded from the yard, Mrs. Ramirez stopped by again. I am glad it worked out, she said. So am I. Some neighbors still think you were too hard on the board, she added gently. Maybe, I said. But soft did not work. That is the thing about communities. Everyone wants harmony, but harmony without accountability is just quiet resentment waiting for a warm front. I did not set out to fight my HOA. I did not enjoy locking that grate. I would have preferred a simple phone call and a quick correction back in January. But every ignored warning, every polite dismissal, stacked up like that snow mound until there was no room left for patience. The contract runs 15 years. Each fall now, I receive the snow management plan in my inbox. I review it with a cup of coffee at this same kitchen table where I first reread the easement. Karen still oversees public works. Victor is still president, though I suspect he reads agreements more carefully these days. And the grate? It stays locked unless I see compliance. That was part of the deal, not as a threat, but as leverage earned the hard way. Sometimes I stand at the edge of the yard after a storm and watch the plows work. They keep their distance now. The snow goes into trucks, not over the ridge. It is quieter this way, but I know something they did not understand before. Infrastructure is invisible until it fails, and the people at the lowest point often carry the highest risk. So here's my question for you. Was I protecting my home, or did I overstep by holding an entire hillside accountable? Should a homeowners association be responsible for maintaining the systems it depends on, even if that responsibility rests on someone else's land? Or should the downslope guy just accept the water and keep quiet for the sake of community peace? I know where I stand, but I am curious where you do. Let me know in the comments.